into the study of our Parsha. I know we have a variety of people here, just as I know we have a variety of people in our Parsha, and as we'll examine today, a variety of sub-personalities within each person of our Parsha. So knowing that we do have some beginners, some newcomers, let me just, maybe once a month, I'll do this really by the numbers. First of all, we have around 52 portions in the Torah. We read in the 5 books of Moses that we call the Torah by custom. The word Torah means teaching. It means instruction. It does not really mean law. It can a teaching or instruction might be law, but the Torah, the word Torah by itself, is related etymologically to the word lehorot, which means to instruct. A moreh or morah is a teacher or instructor. A horeh or hora is a parent. Hora'ah means instruction. So when you think of Torah, you can think of the idea of a teaching with a capital T, like the Tao. This teaching is divided into 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, which is sometimes when you study it, it's studied in what is called a chumash, from the word chamesh, because it's broken down into 5 books. But when we use the word chamesh, it usually means the Hebrew, the Aramaic translation, sometimes an English translation, and at least one interpreter, usually Rashi, of whom I'll speak a little bit today. And then in modern Chumashim, a modern interpretation. So there's a Reform Chumash, there's a conservative Chumash, there are several Orthodox Chumashim. If you hear the word Chumash, think Hebrew text, translation, commentary. So in these 52 portions, a portion gets its name by the first important word in the portion. Our Torah portion is called the Beshalach, and the first words in our Torah portion are Vayehi Beshalach Paro, and it came to be Beshalach Paro when Pharaoh sent out. In Hebrew, the subject Paro succeeds the noun. So we oftentimes have the noun then subject form in Hebrew syntax. Vayehi Beshalach Paro. Now, a Torah portion, the only real logic of a Torah portion, that it's about 1/52nd of the Torah. However, it's not random. It's the ancient rabbis who divided the Torah into their 52 or 54 parshiot, depending on what kind of year we have. And therefore, the first word of the Torah portion, the first sentence of the Torah portion, is chosen by the ancient rabbis. They could have started a couple of verses earlier, a couple of verses later. So what they're trying to do, usually with the first word of the Torah portion, is give you a sense of the theme of the Torah portion, if possible. And sometimes they're telling you how to interpret the Torah portion. So there are some parshiot, because of the first word the rabbis chose to be the so-called title of that Torah portion, they're beginning their interpretation of the Torah portion for you. Now, this Torah portion, Beshalach, I don't think it has that sense of the rabbi telling something mysterious about the Torah portion. It really is the Torah portion about when Pharaoh finally did Shilach, permitted the Israelites to go out of Egypt, and then all the aftermath of that. And of course, the aftermath of that is Pharaoh himself regretting what he had done, the people themselves regretting, many of them, that they had come out of Egypt. So the Torah portion is both filled what we call last time and throughout the Bible, the so-called heroic story, meaning God forcing Pharaoh to let the people out of Egypt, and people gladly accepting their freedom. Of course, at every chapter of the story, it's not as clear as the so-called grand story, the story that one would tell if someone asked you, can you give me the book of Exodus in 1 minute? Well, we probably go to the grand narrative. The subterranean narrative is all the counter narratives that are going on. And this is one of the great themes of Aviva Zornberg. So when we study with Aviva Zornberg, what we're studying is what happens in the Parsha with the help of the Midrash and Rashi. So just a couple of introductory words about that. Remember, the word Midrash refers to not just a bunch of stories, but a concept. The concept of the Midrash aligns very much, by the way, with psychoanalytic theory, all forms of psychoanalytic theory, not just Freud, and modern literary theory, in that while a text might be stable, The meaning of the text is not stable because there's an alive underground counter-narrative going on. For example, irony is a counter-narrative. Sarcasm is a counter-narrative. So those are obvious literary concepts that when you say sarcasm is what you actually don't mean. Sarcasm is the way of saying something by saying something else. You might say irony is the way of saying something by saying something else. So just the way we communicate with each other, we communicate things by saying something that we don't mean to communicate the underground of something that we do mean. Well, the Midrash assumes the entire Bible is composed of figures of speech that make sense at a surface level, but underneath, the great rabbis of the Midrash discover meanings underneath, far beyond irony, far beyond sarcasm, more with a postmodern psychoanalytic idea that sometimes when you say something, it's covering up what you're not saying. To interpret a story one way is to not interpret it another way. Just things of people's private lives. I remember when I was counseling children about telling the truth, and a parent, when I worked in the rehab community, a parent had gone into rehab and was coaching the children what to say. And they say, please don't say that mommy or daddy is an alcoholic and has gone to a rehab center. They say, well, what should I say? Visiting the farm in Nebraska or something. And children would say, well, isn't that lying? And the answer is no, people have a right to privacy. So saying that mommy or daddy is visiting their parents in Nebraska is a way of saying my parents are in rehab, but you just have to choose to whom you say that. Now, that's how we conduct our lives. We conduct our lives by saying things that, number one, might not be true. For example, mommy or daddy's in Nebraska, because the truth of the situation is not everybody deserves to know that mommy or daddy is in rehab. And the higher truth of this is the privacy of the family, and even more deeply, the suffering of the family, the shame of the family, all of the trauma that goes in with someone being a drug addict or an alcoholic, and what it means to finally get into recovery. So hearing you and I say, oh, where is so-and-so? Oh, they're in Nebraska. What's hiding is layers and layers of subterranean stories and pain and narratives that we'll never know because we're not supposed to know. But anybody who's worked in that world knows that for every person who arrives in recovery, for example, there's a wealth of underground meaning. Now, we just take that for granted. Every one of us walks around with a wealth of underground meaning. We don't know the full depths of a human being. In fact, as the psychoanalysts would say, we don't even know our own depths. It's not as if we have a secret we're not telling. There are secrets within us that even we don't know. Okay, every long-term relationship, every marriage, every long-term partnership has its own depths and secrets, not just secrets of things that can't be told, but secrets of things that aren't known. Those of us who've been married a long time will say, sometimes you only understand the marriage after 30 years. Then you understand what it's been about, and you won't know until you put the decades into working through the mutual discovery of self, working through tough things, working through trauma, working through pain, growth, and bliss and joy and love. And the secret language, by the way, of every close couple and every relationship. So when we think of language, we think, oh, language is there to tell a story. And here's the Bible telling a story. Zornberg, because she's a great master of literary criticism and a great master of the Midrash, which is the psychoanalysis of the Bible, meaning you take one thing the Bible says, and the Midrash says, well, what isn't it saying? I just have to tell you, one of the funniest things was when I was learning Talmud. The Talmud is like the Midrash on steroids. So we're studying a passage in Talmud, and oftentimes the dispute, about half of the Talmud is about law, about half is not about law. And we're discussing about something about law, and there's a dispute about, well, is that really the law? Does everybody practice the law that way? Meaning, does everybody understand the text this way? And if they understand the text this way, then how do they understand the text? And if they say that text means that, what do these people say who say the text means this? And it's going around and around and around. And finally, one rabbi says, Kule alma yadin, the whole world knows that this is how you should interpret that text. The next line of Talmud is, okay, so who's he saying doesn't know? Now, the whole class broke into laughter. When the rabbi says, Kule alma yadin, the whole world knows. The next line is, but who's he not telling us about? So even saying everybody knows is a way of saying a lot of people don't think this. I want you to think about that for a moment. Person says everybody knows that a parent should be like this or a child should be like this. Pick something. And you say, well, everybody knows that a good fill in the blank. What they mean is, I don't know. I haven't interviewed 7 billion people. I'm just making this up. I wish it were true. I don't even know if it's logical, rational, anything. I just want you to think it's true. So when I hear somebody say everybody knows, I think to myself, you probably have no idea what you're talking about, and you're just blustering. It's bravado. So when I hear everybody knows, I think bravado, blustering, rhetorically trying to make a case that a person can't make in the phrase everybody knows. By the way, Leonard Cohen's song "Everybody Knows" is a beautiful extended midrash on the term "everybody knows." That when I hear it, it means the opposite of what the person who says everybody knows. Well, now try to imagine you're reading the Bible this way. Now, the thing is, no one is really taught to read the Bible this way until you come to a place like Orator and other places where we take the Midrash as the way to read the Bible. Another way of saying it is, Jews do it with commentary. We read the Bible with the commentary. I think I mentioned you, someone said to me, yeah, I read the book of Exodus and my heart almost stopped. And I thought, you can't mean that you just read the book. You've just read the book of Exodus. I mean, did you read Zornberg in Exodus? Did you read the Midrash with Exodus? So when we say the Midrash, we mean that each word, each phrase of the story has subterranean depths. The depths all speak to each other. And so it's not that the surface text doesn't have a meaning, but you might say the Jewish meaning, the inner spiritual meaning of the text is found in the Midrash. And there's no better author than Aviva Zornberg who continually brings that out. Now, Aviva Zornberg can be obscure, and I want to help with that a little bit today. Okay, so what's in our Torah portion before I dive into the deep dive that I want to do? Pharaoh sends us out of Egypt. It says God sends us out. Pharaoh sends us out of Egypt at God's will, at God's behest. God sends them on a roundabout circuit. We're going to talk about that in a moment. They take Joseph's bones out of Egypt. There's a lot of midrash there we're not going to talk about today. There's a pillar of cloud during the day, a pillar of fire at night. A lot of midrash on that. We're not going to talk about it. So that ends chapter 13. We are going to do a deep dive in chapter 14 today, so I'll wait with that. But in general, they arrive at the Yam Suf, not the Red Sea, Sea of Reeds. Suf means reeds, R-E-D-S. In fact, when Moshe was born, his mother put him in the Suf, in the reeds. And that's why I would rather say Yam Suf or Sea of Reeds, because the author wanted to connect where Moshe's mother put him and where the people end up at the other end of Moshe's life. And those of you know the deeper commentary on this. What is Moshe's name? He's called Moshe by daughter Pharaoh, who knew a bit of Hebrew apparently. And she says, Ki mashiti oto min hamayim, I pulled him out of the water. Well, if Moses is the one who was pulled out of the water, his name should be Mashui, pulled out, or Nimsha, not Moshe. Moshe is the active case, the one who pulls people out of the water. So she pulls him out of the Nile and says his name is Moshe, the one who pulls people out of the water. Of course, in this Torah portion, Moshe is pulling people out of the water. So just by reading the Hebrew carefully and comparing when he's put in the reeds in the beginning of the story, he's pulling people through the Sea of Reeds. Here in the story, the subterranean parts of the text begin to surface out of those murmuring depths, as Viva Zornberg puts it. In any case, we're going to go through some of this. Chapter 15, we have this wonderful song of the sea. It's an incredible piece of poetry. If you want to read a great translation, you want to go to the Reform Chumash called The Torah, translated by Gunther Plaut, Plaut. He's the editor of the book, of the edition. So there are several translations of Shirat Hayam, the Song at the Sea. The best is written by a great biblical scholar. Almost no one reads him today. I plan to introduce him to you over the next couple of weeks, named David Daiches, Daiches. He was a great British literary theorist. He turned his able hand to the study of the Bible and wrote the best translation to the Song of the Sea that I have ever read. David Daiches, Daiches. In his book, Moses, not well read anymore, I received a copy for my bar mitzvah. Therefore, I assumed it's not for me. It's somebody, some old Jew, meaning somebody younger than me, gave me the book. I put it away. I recently rediscovered it. I said, wow, it's a great book. I want to share it with you. Okay, so that's 14 and 15. Chapter 16, we get out into the wilderness, and the first things that happen is they regret leaving Egypt. They want to go back to Egypt. Now, this is a development that we already see coming embryonically earlier, that the people are not whole with leaving Egypt, and things just get worse in chapter 16. They start to complain about food. They get God and Moses overwhelmed them with quail. Again, testing God. The manna, what is this thing? Manna has the word ma in it, question, which is a theme, by the way, in chapter 14 that we'll look in just a moment. More testing, more contentions with God, until next week's Torah portion, which is the revelation of Torah at Mount Sinai. By the way, if you were to read our Torah portion straight into next week's Torah portion, you would already have a great sense of foreboding that this giving of the Torah out at Mount Sinai is almost guaranteed not to go well when you pay attention in our Torah portion who these people are and who are they. They are representatives of us, meaning these are archetypes of who we are. Now, all that being said, we're going to go back to our Torah portion, chapter 14. I want to weave a little bit of Zornberg in as I give this to you. But remember, what I really want to, which Zornberg doesn't do. Now, Zornberg is really the unparalleled master of the Midrash. Many Midrashim. We have the so-called the Great Midrash Shemot Rabbah, the Great Exodus, the Great Exodus. There's a Midrash called Tanchuma, which is a contemporaneous of the Rabbah, the Shemot Rabbah. And there are many, many other Midrashim, maybe 10 great ones that I know Zornberg studies because he brings them down. There's a unique Midrash to the book of Exodus called the Mechilta. And again, you can find this online, I'm sure. So anybody who studies the Midrash on the book of Exodus is studying Shemot Rabbah, which means the great Midrash on the book of Exodus, Shemot. They're studying Midrash Tanchuma, which is, by the way, is a very accessible, if you can find it in English, it is not difficult. It's not one of those complex kinds of Midrashim that fold in and on themselves. It's very clear. And the Mechilta, which is a little more difficult to read because it's assuming you understand the textual problems. So you might go from one line to the next and say, well, it doesn't make sense. It's because there's an interplay going on that you don't know. By the way, some parts of the Haggadah are taken from the Mechilta, not from the Shemot Rabbah, not from Tanchuma. All right, so you get a sense of what Midrash is. So who's Rashi in all of this? Rashi has studied all of these Midrashim. Rashi was in the south of France. He went to Alsace-Lorraine to study with the German masters. He was there for, if I'm not mistaken, for about a decade. And what he was able to do was to learn there every line of the Talmud and every line of the Bible, including all of the difficult passages. He comes back to France. He opens an academy. As far as what we can tell is, he would teach the entire Talmud one line at a time, telling everybody what each passage meant, and he taught the entire Bible, one line at a time, with what each passage meant. The Talmud that we have, nearly every line of the Talmud has Rashi's commentary. We would not know what the Talmud meant without Rashi's commentary. Now, Rashi was a genius. He's sometimes called the Peshat, the easy version. That's not true. Sometimes when Rashi would come at a verse, he'd say, here's what the verse means, just in case you can't figure it out. He'd take it a level down. Well, here's some of the grammar, some of the Hebrew, because there might just be a Hebrew word you can't figure out. Sometimes he translates it into French. By the way, Rashi is a great source for Old French. Sometimes he says, well, this is pretty clear. Let me bring a midrash down. And this is where Zornberg finds him so fascinating, because Rashi, in the guise of, let me just tell you what it says, what you see is Rashi is taking a mountain of midrash, boils it down to one statement, puts it in there, and the attentive reader says, he just brought down into one thread an entire quilt. And then a few verses later, he'll bring another thread of that quilt. And you realize in a very, very sophisticated, almost unseen way, many times what Rashi is doing is building his own underground narrative. His underground narrative is taken from the vast quilt of the Midrash. Rashi has taken strands from the quilt and chosen from the Midrash the quilt that he wants to point out to. Now, I had never read anybody so respectful of Rashi until I got to Aviva Zornberg, because you'll almost hear in any Orthodox environment, including Israel, Rashi is the Peshat. He's the simple meaning of the text. I remember thinking to myself, no, he's not. Sometimes he is, but most of the time he isn't. It wasn't until I read Zornberg that I finally found someone who said it outright. Rashi is a great theologian. Rashi is a great psychologist. Rashi is a master of literary interpretation. He just does it in such a simple way, it can go right by you. It's another one of my great gratitudes to Aviva Zornberg is she's brought that out. So I want to read a little bit to you, and in the back of my mind, I have a Zornberg, I have the Midrash, I have some Rashi, a few other things. I thought about putting all my sources here going back and forth, but I really like to be sure to bring in those of you who are new at this, so I can just make sure to everything I say, build an easy ramp up, because Zornberg is not easy. Other thing Zornberg doesn't do, she doesn't make direct application to the inner life. She doesn't just, tap it on the nose and say, this is about you. This is about you when you do this. So she takes a step back from her readers and her students and wants us to make the interpretation. Most of the time, Aviva Zornberg does not connect the tissue of the text to the tissue of our inner life. So I'd like to do that a bit as well. So we're going to go back to chapter 13, Exodus chapter 13, beginning of our Torah portion, 13. And I'm going to pick about 5 different verses from our portion, finish up, take a break, and then I'll like to have Sherry Manning offer a comment afterwards. So when Pharaoh sent the people out of Egypt, okay, so Pharaoh's sending them out. It says, "Velo naham Elohim derech eretz plishtim." Lo nacham Elohim derech plishtim. Now, here's an interesting thing. Lahanchot does mean to guide. Okay, a manche, for example, is on a TV show is the MC. Okay, so a manche does mean to guide, but there's a deep play going on, because you will find sometimes it will say, and God nicham, which means regret. So nicham with a certain preposition means regret that they did something. It also can mean to comfort someone. So if I say, ani menachem otcha, I am comforting you. If I say, ani nicham she'asiti et zeh, I regret having done this. What Zornberg points out is the connection between the word nacham as remorse, regret, and the word nacham as compassion, meaning when it's going to somebody outside, it's changing the mind. So if I comfort you, I'm trying to change the state of your inner life. If I say, nichamti she'asiti et zeh, I regret having done that, I've gone through a change of mind. Now, where is the the greatest word for God regretting in our Bible. And by the way, every time I see the word nishama in the Bible, it takes me automatically back to Genesis 6, which is the great turning point in our first Torah portion. You don't have to go with me. Genesis chapter 6, verse 5. Vayar Adonai ki rabba ra'at ha'adam ba'aretz, and God saw that the evil of the human being was great in the world. V'chol yetzer machshavot libo rak ra kol hayom, and all the shaping of his inner life was all bad all day long. Vayinachem Adonai ki asa et hadam, and God regretted having made the human being. He's not comforting the human beings. God regrets having made the human beings. Now, where is this line most egregiously misquoted? Y'all know where I'm going. To other great constant source of the Bible for me, which is the book of Job. So here we have, it says, and God regretted making the human being. We go over to the book of Job. This is playfully, but I always like to connect these two. We've been here many times. You can, if you want to see it with me, you can go over to the book of Job, chapter 42, if I'm not mistaken. Job's confrontation with God. So my Bible, by the way, gets this completely wrong. And the marginal note says, Job repents. Job repents. And so what happens at the very end here? We've been through this so many times, I just want to read it short here. Job has this confrontation with God and realizes God did do all this out of wickedness. Job did not deserve it. Job's been challenging God. God is trying to bluster God's way through it. God's trying to intimidate Job, overwhelm Job with God's power. Job's not buying 1 minute of it. In a way, Job a little bit like our Invictus from last night. And finally, Job says the following. Leshema ozen shmaticha. I heard about you with my ear. Va'ata ene ra'atcha. And now I see who you are. Al ken emas, and therefore I'm disgusted. V'nichamti al efer va'afar, and I feel sorry for your humanity. Now, many people say this nichamti as I regret, I have remorse. The syntax doesn't fit it, the language doesn't fit it, because people can't stand the idea of God saying, I'm disgusted, I feel sorry for humanity. That is the end of the Job's speech to God on page 42. Now, how did I get here? I know Genesis chapter 6:5. I know Job 41. I know that the word nicham can have two completely different meanings. One is regret, as God says in Genesis 6, 5, and 6. And one where Job says, not I regret, but rather I feel sorry for. In a different verb form is he would actually comfort. All right, so now going back to our Torah portion, you can see the richness of just looking at the beginning of our Torah portion, which is the book of Exodus chapter 13. So when it says in the book of Exodus chapter 13, remember, this is a chapter, including the antecedent and subsequent chapters, where there is a much deal of regret. People regretting what they've done. God seemed to regret that he brought this people out of Egypt. The people regret that they came out of Egypt. So while the word nacham does have the meaning to lead, there are other Hebrew words to lead. There are other Hebrew words where it says, and God led them a certain way. The authors of the Bible chose a word that brings in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5, where God says, I regret having done the whole thing. It says later, they're a bad, stiff-necked people. They're bent on evil. So just with that word at the beginning of our Torah portion, Lo nacham Elohim derech eretz haplishtim, God did not lead them that way. The word nacham has a redolence of Genesis chapter 6. In my mind, a redolence of Job saying, I feel sorry for these people, and the idea of regret and remorse that fills so much of these narratives in the Torah. So he says he doesn't want to take them derech plishtim, ki karob, because it was too close. Now that's odd, because it was too close. And then it says, Ki amar Elohim. And now God is actually sharing, the author is sharing God's private thoughts with us. Ki amar Elohim, to God's self, pen yinachem. Same word again, yinachem. They will regret. Just as God regretted creating humanity over in Genesis chapter 6, God says the people are going to regret. Pen yinachem ha'am birotam milchama. Now, my English says people will reconsider. Probably true, reconsider. But remember, Yinachem is overloaded with the meaning regret. Regret what? Regret that they came out of Egypt. And this is where the Midrash kicks in. The Midrash on this parsha brings us things that were said earlier and later that show the people actually have great resistance to leaving Egypt. They really don't want to go. Now, this is a very deep thing. And by the way, I oftentimes find this in my counseling practice. When it's oftentimes a parent with a child or a spouse who really wants something, and or just any kind of dispute, and someone's really trying to persuade someone something to do it. So a person said, I really want to vacation in such and such a place, but my family wants to vacation somewhere else, so I'm really talking them into it. I said, here's what's likely to happen. If one thing goes wrong in the place that you want, everyone will find fault with you. Because when you push people into doing something that they don't want to do, they will do it poorly or they'll find fault with you. It's a rule of human nature. If there's 613 rules of human nature, this is about number 4. So what we know all this time is the people cry out to God. We'll talk about that. They cry out to God. They're crying out that they're suffering. That's true. But as we'll see, in those crying out to God, there are many levels of that crying, because part of that crying is we're crying because we're suffering, but we don't want your solution. We don't mind you're taking the suffering off of us. That doesn't mean we're signing up for your whole program. So people will regret. The regret is deep. It's embedded. It's a deep part of our story. When they see war, what war will they be seeing? Well, the Peshat is the Philistines will fight them. The Midrash is there was an earlier breakout from Egypt, and some Israelites broke out before the time was ripe, the kairos, as it were, the ripened time. They were defeated by the Philistines, and their bones were still laying all over the battleground. So it's not that they would see war with the Philistines. They would see the battlefield debris of a prior war where their ancestors had been slaughtered by the Philistines. Now, what this means basically is they're going to feel fear. The minute these people encounter fear, they will want to run back to Egypt. Now, that's proven out by what happens throughout the story. The people aren't ready. They want to go back to Egypt. They don't have courage. Now, we see this exacerbated later on in the story. And again, the Midrash and Rashi all point us to the sin of the spies. When they go in to scout out the land, they say there are giants here, and we look like grasshoppers to them, and we're terrified. And they come back with the night of weeping. And even in the Midrash here, God says, I hear what you're saying to each other, just as I heard what they were saying to each other when they didn't want to go into Canaan, what they're saying about me, what they're saying about Moses, which is God has an ear to their inner lives. God has an ear to their inner lives. And what they say, we're too scared. We hate God for bringing us into a situation where our fear was elicited, even shame. We hate being brought into a situation where our own inadequacy as human beings is brought to the fore. What do people do when you bring them into a situation where they have fear? Well, some people hate you for doing it. What happens when you're brought into a situation where you have to face your inadequacies? Well, some people will hate you that they are now aware of their inadequacies. What does a person, we talked about last night about the authentic human being. What does an authentic human being do? An authentic human being says, well, down here in the reality of my being, there is an ego state of fear. And down here in the reality of my being, there is an ego state of shame, of my inadequacy. Those are real parts of me. The question is, can a higher part of me not allow those ego states to take me over, whatever it might be? There's resentment here. There's fear. There's shame. Can a higher self says, yes, you're there, but you are not leading the spiritual system? Can a different part of our inner life, what we'll call the one connected to our deepest authenticity and our deepest vision, I'm going to call that the realm of the nishama, of the spirit or the soul, can that replace that with something more aligned to our authenticity as human beings? Well, Joshua and Caleb do that back at the sin of the spies. And one thing you see during these Torah portions, there's almost always some group that says, let's not get frozen in fear. Let's not get frozen in resentment. Let's go ahead and live with courage. Let's go ahead and live in a sense that I'd rather die than be afraid, as in our Torah portion. I'd rather go into that water and die than sit here being terrified. I'm not letting that take me over. So the idea that where God says, if they see, going with the Midrash now, if they see the bones of their ancestors, they're going to go bolt right back to Egypt, because God says they always want to bolt back to Egypt. The entire time they're in the Sinai desert, what are they talking about at night? What are they talking about when there's a pillar of cloud during the day and the pillar of fire at night? What are they saying in their tents? I really hate this. I don't want to be there. This is too hard. I don't trust Moses. I don't trust Aaron. God brought us out here to kill us. They say that many times. I want to go back to Egypt. This is, as it were, the other story of what God's dealing with. God's dealing with the fact that human beings are not just ambivalent, they're deeply resistant to the whole thing. They're deeply resistant to the whole thing. We're going to now go over to chapter 14. And I'm going to continue this theme, again, bringing in Zornberg, the Midrash, Rashi, and the psychological dimension that I want truly, truly to feel that through Zornberg's gifts applies to you, applies to me, to the archetypal condition. God says, speak to the children of Israel and let them turn back and encamp before Pi-hachirot, between Migdol and the sea, before Baal Tzafon. You shall encamp opposite by the sea. Now here's the Midrash on that, which Zornberg brings down. God says, I want you to turn around and face those Egyptians. You're running away right now. God says, I get it. You want to get out of there. But I want you to turn around and look at them. And why do I think this? Because there's already a Caleb and Joshua. There's already a group of people who are running. God says, stop, turn around. Now, as he told them to stop and turn around, in my imagination, a bunch of, I said, no, we don't want to see them. We want to back off. We want to get out of here. And suddenly there's a group that looks at these people and say, we're not going to die afraid of you people. We might die right here, but we're not going to die afraid of you people. And the Egyptians are coming down. So my theory is God has them turn around just so that a few of them can discover courage. Most won't. Some will. And when they discover courage, they'll discover what they're made of. Now, sometimes people don't know they're courageous until the suffering brings it out. And I've known many people who have said, I don't believe God has brought this suffering upon me. However, I would have never known what I was made of until I faced great suffering. And when I faced great suffering, parts of myself were revealed to me that I would have never known. Now, this is a tough thing to think, because then people think, now, remember, I think this is an error, but I might be in error. I don't believe that the loving God of the universe places suffering on people to teach them a lesson. I don't believe that. I could be wrong, meaning I might get to the other side and I'll try to reach back on everybody and say, Finley was wrong. So if you hear a voice from heaven saying, Finley was wrong, okay, I'm regretting saying it because I was wrong. I just don't believe it. My conception of God is not God says, I will pound you with suffering for a teaching lesson, for an object lesson. Here's what I do believe. God places within every human being capacities for wisdom and courage and resilience. All these wonderful qualities that exist within us in potential. Now, what a wise human being does is train. I mean, I got this certainly when I was in the military. I never saw any live combat, but we trained. And, one thing that we trained is run to the sound of gunfire. If you hear gunfire, it's probably our guys versus their guys. Go there. Secondly, and your job is to take a bullet for a civilian or take a bullet for one of your buddies. That's why you're here. Okay? Your job is to bring the fight to the enemy. So again, I was only in boot camp for 3 months. I've only spent 3 weeks in intense infantry training, but the whole ethos was that. Now, when did this come to bear? I'm part of my own story. Many of you know that back in the late 1970s, I was at an active shooter incident at LAX. And a person was shooting over at the next carousel, came out, walked down the sidewalk. I, like everybody, went to hide, and I told the story very vividly. I was lying on my back under a bench, and just something in my, I'd been out of the Marine Corps about maybe 6 years. This was about 3 years. This was 79. I got out in 76. My old Marine kicked back in and said, I'm not going to get shot lying down. So I got up. I snuck to the wall, the column separating me from the sidewalk. I really didn't know what I was going to do, except I was not going to die. I was not going to get shot lying down. Person turned the corner. It was a woman, bigger than me, had a huge handgun. I don't remember exactly what happened. Time stopped for a moment. I saw the white of her eyes were actually yellow. She had a crazed look on her face, a massive handgun. Somehow I disarmed her. The firearm went flying, got her on the ground. Now, by the way, I'm a little bit ashamed to say that I was the only one. Secondly, a young Marine in uniform snuck up behind me, and I said to the Lance Corporal, I said, Lance Corporal, we're going to take her. We're going to take this person down. I didn't know who it was yet. He ran. The Marine Corps didn't get deep enough inside of him. Now, why am I sharing this with you? The only reason I did that, in my mind, was training. I think I have the capacity to be personally courageous. I do. But the training made me do it without even thinking. People say, it was so courageous. I said, the courageous thing was to join the Marines. All this was training. I heard the gunshots. I said, no, I'm not getting shot lying down. I went there. I wasn't conquering fear. I was just doing my duty. Now, I don't think God gave me that moment because other people did get shot over in their carousel before. But something in me, when I was 18 years old on this spiritual path, knew I had to go into the Marine Corps to clean myself up and to find my own pure being without any of the noise that I had, when I was in high school. That brought me to that moment. Now, I don't want to imagine how many lives I saved. It's not clear. Did I save lives? But when I read about the guy in Monterey Park who disarmed that mass murderer when he came in the room, that young man probably saved, we don't know, 12 lives. What made him that way? What made him the guy who stood at the door and said, you all run, I'm staying at the door, I'm taking this guy down? Who is that guy? I'd like to know. Because I did that once. I didn't think about the lives I've saved. I just know that's where I have to be. Now, I want to track myself back, to that moment when I said, I don't want to have all these unruly emotions governing my life. I want to go somewhere where no one has time for my emotions because the only thing important is my duty. And I knew that that military service would give that to me. The only thing important was my duty. All this other stuff is just noise. Now, so so now you can see that I'm bringing my autobiography into this Midrash that I'm sharing with you. But it's in the Midrash, but I'm showing that I'm buttressing the Midrash with my own life experience. God turns them around so some can say, I'm not gonna die afraid. Now, choosing not to die afraid, in my mind, is the arch decision that no negative emotion has to control your life. Whatever your negative emotion is, anger, regret, remorse, resentment, fear, shame, victimhood, confusion, whatever it is, ask yourself, would I face death to get rid of that? And if the arch emotion is fear, and you're willing to die instead of feel fear, well, then you can work on any of them. You can work on any of them. So for me, this is the archetype of God turning them around and saying, you see what's coming at you? And they say, doesn't matter, we're going to hold our ground. What is that for me? Hold your ground. In fact, my class at the rehab center was called Hold the Line. That was my class, Hold the Line. And that's what it is so often with the guys who are facing relapse and horrible emotions. I try to get them down to the moment when you're inside yourself, you're facing your greatest demon. It could be the bottle. It could be the refrigerator. It could be your absolutely out of control spouse, child, parent provoking you. You hit the line and you say, I'm not feeling what you want me to feel. I'm not feeling what you're triggering me to feel. I'm in charge of here. I'm in charge of what's in here. And I will act in the noblest way possible. So this was very deep for me when I read Zornberg quoting the Midrash saying God turned them around to see their enemy. And this is something, the way that I'm interpreting it, I think every person listening to this has had a moment when you felt, I'm facing an external reality. I have a range of feelings to feel. There's a dominant one that wants to jump on and lead this moment. It doesn't have to be that one. So how do you make sure that a different inner state takes over the moment, leads the moment as it were? Train. And that, of course, is part of the key Torah that I teach. I think even if you dare hear my voice shouting to you from the heavens, I'll say, keep training. That one I'm not going to take back. So here they are. Now, there's something fascinating here. It says they should, they are at Pi HaChirot. Who knows if that's a place, but Pi HaChirot means something like the fount of freedom. Pi is a mouth, but it can also mean like a spring of a river. It can be a well. Pi HaChirot could be the well at a place called Chirot. It can't be an accident that Hebrew Chirut. Freedom is right here. So he turns them around, and they camp at a place that is the mouth of freedom, the beginning of freedom, and Lifnei Baal Tzefon. So the Midrash says, who's Baal Tzefon? It's a big Egyptian carving of one of their gods. I just want you to think the brilliance here. He turns them around. They go, this is freedom. This is freedom place. We're at the freedom well. And right there is a sculpted god of Egypt. And all of a sudden, their whole life makes sense. Meaning, we're standing at the freedom oasis looking at the God of Egypt. That is our whole life. That's everything in life when you're doing inner work. Find your way to the well of freedom and face the monster, face the dragon, face it. And that's where the spiritual warrior takes place. The spiritual warrior takes place between at your understanding that you have freedom, face your monster. Your monster would be, I'm reactive. I got to talk when someone else's talk. It could be fear. It could be being dominant. It could be avoidance. There are so many things that each one of us face. That's your monster. That's your Baal Tzefon. That's your carving of the gods of Egypt. Each one has a few of our own. They're not the same. They're finite, but they're not the same. I looked at this and I thought to myself, plant yourself at the well of freedom and face the Egyptian God. Now, how do I know it's the Egyptian God? Because the Midrash says so. So look at the intuitiveness of the Midrash that says, plant yourself at the well of freedom, face the Egyptian God. I take that and say to myself, I hope I remember this for the rest of my pedagogic career, because this is everything I'm teaching about is right here. Plant yourself at the well of freedom, look at the Egyptian God, and hold your ground. Then it says a little bit further. So Pharaoh sees them turning around like this, and Pharaoh says, oh, they're lost. Pharaoh doesn't understand. No, they just turned around, or God had them turned around to fight you. Pharaoh says, oh, they're lost. And what does he say? This is so great. It says, Va'amar Paro lebnei Israel, Nivuchim heim ba'aretz. Nivuchim heim ba'aretz. Does anybody know where the word Nivuchim shows up in Jewish literature? One of the greatest books in all of Jewish literature is called Moreh Nivuchim, the Guide for the Perplexed. Moses' great book, the Guide for the Perplexed, the greatest book in all of Jewish philosophy, is named after this exact moment, Moreh Nivuchim. Moreh Nivuchim, the Guide for the Nivuchim. What does my English translation say? It says, imprisoned in the land. Navoch means something like meaning you're in a place and you can't find your way out. Perplexed as much as lost in a maze. Lost in a maze. So what was the maze for Moses Maimonides? The maze for Moses Maimonides was, like the Arabs before him, the Islamic theologians before him, people had read Aristotle. They had read Plato. And if you're a spiritually sensitive person and you read Aristotle or Plato, you know you've discovered the truth. On the other hand, there's a truth called the revelation, and they can't figure it out. And this was a crisis. And Moses Maimonides says, you are imprisoned in this maze. I'm going to lead you out. Moreh Nivuchim, the guide for the perplexed, meaning the guide that will take the people out of this moment when they're facing Pharaoh, they're facing their worst. For Maimonides, the worst was they had lost faith in the tradition, and the Rambam was going to lead them out. Maybe one more pasuk, and then I will wrap up for this morning. By the way, this is just a few more little verses. Then in verse 4, God says, "I will strengthen the heart of Pharaoh, and he will pursue them, and thus I will be glorified." So the discussion we had before, what was God's motive? Was Pharaoh doing this to himself? Was he just a stubborn, obstinate guy? Well, here it says very clearly, says, I'm going to make Pharaoh an object lesson because I have to be glorified for him, so the people will know of all time that he's my plaything. I mean, God is like a lion with the prey that he just kicks around a little bit until God can finally, as it were, destroy the prey. So he's playing with Pharaoh. On the other hand, Pharaoh is an absolute true menace. So I think the Bible is of itself of several minds when it comes to this story. So the Egyptians are pursuing the people, and then in a way, the next verse actually belongs before that. It says, "It had been told to the king of Egypt, people had fled, and the heart of Pharaoh's people had been transformed." The Hebrew word is v'hafach. Change of heart immediately. Hafach, meaning earlier Pharaoh said, a little bit of truth mind, this is really happening. The God of the universe has really come, contrary to any expectation. I did not see this coming, that this miserable slave people here would suddenly gain the attention of the God of the universe. Who saw this coming? And Pharaoh and his astrologers and necromancers said, this is real. We don't understand it. We have no theory behind this, but it is actually happening. Okay? Now try to imagine the times in your life when you took a deep breath, and as I said in my Shabbat thought, you're not hoping for something to be different. You're not trying to think your way into a different reality. You're not praying for a different reality. You're saying to yourself, well, this is real. I had two choices. I can avoid it. I can deny it. I can language my way around it. I can blame somebody, do whatever I want to do, but this is real. And my options here is to handle this in a mindful way, courageous way, or not. That's all I got. So what happens to Pharaoh? Pharaoh says things were transformed, and he goes, "Oh, that didn't happen. This is not me. This is not me versus. This is not I versus the God of the universe. What have we done, sending them away?" I can imagine his astrologers, necromancers, and magicians all raising their hand and said, "Can we remind you what you have done? Can we remind you of the 10 plagues?" There's a reason they're running and we're back here, in camp. Pharaoh has lost his mind, has completely lost his mind. God pushed him into it a bit, but I don't think you can make a crazed insanopath lose their mind if they weren't going a little bit in that direction to begin with. He says, ma asinu. So he goes chasing after the people. And then they say to Moses, verse 11, what have you done? Ma asita lanu. What have you done taking us out of Egypt to die in Egypt? Ma, is this not what we said to you? Let us be and we will serve Egypt. It is better we should serve Egypt than we should die in the wilderness. The people are saying down in verse 12. I just want you to try to imagine God is hearing this. God has gone through not just doing 10 plagues, thinking up 10 plagues. I mean, if I said to you, I want you to think up 10 plagues upon the Egyptians, you could say, oh, hail? Nah, it's a desert. Turn the blood Nile red? That's impossible. Try to imagine coming up with 10 plagues, number one. Number two, the engineering problems were probably, God is working with reality. These huge engineering problems, chemical problems, all kinds of stuff going on. God pulls them off one after the other. It looks easy to us. I don't know if it's easy for God or not. God does all that, has all the drama, all the tsuris, all the emotions back and forth. And they said, at the moment they're supposed to get out, they go, nah, we don't want to. What are you doing? We want to go back there. I'm just trying to imagine, because we know that God has emotions. I just assume God takes a deep breath and goes, all right, don't get upset. That's where they're at. I'll work on that later. Right now, I'm going to give them a chance. I'm just going to get them through the water. So I take on for God a little bit here. Moses tries to quiet them down. Don't fear, stand fast. God's going to make war for you. And God says to Moses, quit talking to me. Such an interesting thing. They're yelling at God. Moses is yelling at them. God says to Moses, don't keep yelling at me. They're all coming apart a little bit. Lift up your staff and go. Finally, the angel of God, probably the only calm spirit in this entire group of people, who's been going in front of them, comes between the Egyptians. The Egyptians get lost out there. Moses stretches his hand. God moves the sea, and the children came into the sea on dry land, and the water was a wall before them. Concludes the chapter 14. Anyway, my main goal today was not to deliver over to you all the complexities of Zornberg. If you're up to it, you can do that yourself. Not even tell you that everything that the Midrash says. I brought a little bit of it down. My goal today was to show you a little bit of what it means to read Torah, having read the Midrash, having read Zornberg, but then my main goal is, what does it mean to me? What does it mean to me? And hoping that what it means to me might speak to some of you, I read this and I zoomed down to, they're standing at the oasis, the well of freedom, facing the statue of the Egyptian god. I just felt my heart plunge into that moment. And I remember thinking last night, this morning, this is what I got to think of. This is what I got to talk about. I got to talk about that moment. Because if it meant this much to me, it probably meant something to you, where you were at that moment. And again, it might not be courage. It might be something else. I want each of you to reach into your hearts and ask yourself, when was I in the middle of something with somebody else in life? And that old habit came up that makes me miserable, or I make somebody else miserable. And it seemed like the most real thing in the world, that's my only course of action. And some voice from the higher self says, you don't have to. You're standing at the well of freedom. You're facing your biggest monster. At the rehab center, it was drink, take drugs. For the rest of us, it's something else. But you're facing the dragon. You're facing the monster. You're at the well of freedom. Breathe. Feel your freedom. Go into the deepest parts of your being. Reach into the depths of your authenticity. Reach into the fact that those other paths are not necessary paths. They're part of Yetzer Machshavo Libo Rak Ra Kol Hayom. They're the path of the Yetzer is all bad all day long. That's that part of you. there's another part of you. There's the soul. There's the spirit. You have to breathe deeply, close your eyes, and bring up those alternative ways of being. Align them with spirit, align them with soul, align them with the divine. Take your stand and birth yourself across the Yam Suf into becoming a new human being. We'll stop my teaching here for today. We'll take a brief break. When I come back, hopefully, Sherry, you'll have a quick question about something that I taught today. Open it up to a few other people and go on with our morning. Again, for those of you who are leaving, Shabbat Shalom. Thank you so much for joining us. Public service announcement. We hope that you support the synagogue. All this requires a lot of funds, a lot of attention, and your financial aid, of course, means a great deal to us. Main thing is, thanks for joining us, and I hope it's been a worthwhile way to spend part of your Shabbat morning.